Hi everyone. I'm Humphrey. I'm the president of Asian Australian Project, and I'm going to be your MC for tonight. And we warmly welcome you to our first ever Fireside Chats. In case you're new to what we do, we empower young Asian Australians to engage with and embrace our unique cultural identities. And just for reference, we define Asian Australian as anyone with Asian ethnic or cultural heritage who lives in or has lived in Australia. But our events are open to everyone, and I'm sure you don't have to be young or Asian Australian to learn something from them. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm conducting the event from today in Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from wherever you might be tuning in from. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be here today. Just a bit of housekeeping as well before we start. So let's introduce the topic for tonight. Our topic is initiatives exploring diversity. So tonight we really wanted to highlight and explore some issues that are relevant to Asian Australians, as well as several awesome Asian Australians and the initiatives they're involved in, which help to address these issues. And we really hope you're going to learn something about Asian Australian culture tonight, hopefully about yourselves as well, and hopefully be really inspired by our panelists. So let's introduce all four panelists tonight. Firstly, we have Mr. Jay Uy. He's the creator of Shoes Off, which is a podcast that aims to discuss and explore various aspects of Asian Australian culture. The podcast has just finished its second season, so 16 episodes in total, and has explored topics as diverse as the history of Asian Australians, racial dating preferences, diversity in the workplace, and even the phenomenon of bubble tea culture. Secondly, we have Dr. Samantha Lin, who is Chinese Australian. And while growing up in Sydney, Samantha became quite passionate about studying English, which culminated in her completion of a PhD in Shakespeare Studies from Durham University in the UK. After this, she founded and is now the principal of Shakespeare Academy, which is an English literature tuition school with a sizable Asian clientele. And she also created Crazy's Reading Asians, which is a book club that explores literature by Asian writers. Thirdly, we have Shona Yang. Shona is a Korean-Australian freelance writer who writes about Asian Australian experiences. She really champions minority voices, particularly in Australian media, and has contributed to a variety of sources such as SBS, Moonrise, Walkley magazine, as well as her own blog, Shona Says. Shona's also covered a variety of really important topics such as how a culture of saving face can affect experiences of domestic violence, Asian surnames and job applications, and the lack of diversity within Asian Australian media. And last but not least, we have Mr. Pravin Silva, who is a Sri Lankan Australian project coordinator within the diplomacy team at AsiaLink. So AsiaLink, as part of the University of Melbourne, helps to build cultural, business and civic ties between Australia and the greater Asian region. And Pravin was directly involved in coordinating the Asian Australian Leadership Summit, which was first held last year in 2019. And it's a national summit which looks at the underrepresentation of Asian Australians in senior leadership in Australia. So with all this setup, and by the way, we will share the socials of all four panelists at the end so that you can connect with them and find out more about what they do. But with all this set up, let's start off with an introductory question. And this is open to all four panelists. So we've kind of defined what Asian Australian is, and we kind of all intuitively know what it is. But when we think about it, Asia is like an incredibly diverse place. We have so many cultures, ethnicities, religions. But in Australia, we tend to group all that diversity together under the banner of the term Asian Australian. And even in our initiatives, we tend to use this very broad terminology. So what are your opinions on like why this happens? And do you think by doing this, we can risk not capturing some specific stories or specific nuances within particular cultures?
I'll just start by saying because it's easy. There are so many different groups from people who look quite different to each other who fall under the bracket of Asian Australian. There's no other word that people readily have at hand. People find language awkward. I found, so I'm Sri Lankan Australian. Often people don't know how to refer to people from South Asia or the Indian subcontinent. They'll say we're curry or desi. Some of, curry is problematic. Desi is more common. A lot of people don't know it and some people don't identify with it. So I think it's just a way of, just grouping us all together, but it also does make us seem like a monolith.
So I did a whole episode on this term Asia. If you've never thought about it, you're going to think about it right now. So you've got Asia and you've got Europe. It might be the other way around for you. But when you think about where they are in the world, the divide that exists between them isn't a clear continental divide in the way that we think of Africa, North America, South America, right? They're all the same. They're on the same big landmass, Europe and Asia. So where the heck did this divide come from? This is what the episode explores. And then we go into the modern day use of the term Asian, which is very specific in Australia, and it's different in, for example, the UK. And I think there's two things here. Firstly, it is a way that we are othered and we're all grouped together, and to say if you're Chinese, your opinion is the representative of all Asians. But on the other hand, every single grouping that we do is a generalization of some sort. So there's no one definitive culture for people who are Australian, right? There's no one definitive culture for Western or Eastern or Vietnamese or Korean. These are all grouping umbrella terms, and there's a lot of diversity within each of those terms. So all these terms are useful in a way because they help us see patterns and trends, and they also give us a banner to organize under, in the same way that homosexuals and transsexuals and gender non-binary are all very different, but they all band under the same group of queer or LGBTQI+, because then they have power and influence. And so I think that's the same with us. We can have power and influence by banding under the term Asian, but we have to be aware of its limitations, which is that, it's a big generalization, and we lose a lot of the subtleties and nuance. Which means when we're talking about things that are specific to our own culture, for example, when I talk about me being Malaysian, Chinese, Australian, if it's specific to me and it might not apply to the rest of Asian culture, then maybe I should be more specific that it's about my own culture. But yes, I do think the term is useful. Go listen to season 1, Ep 8.
Such a good plug, Jay. Go listen to season 1 and season 2. Such a good podcast. I just want to jump off the back of that and add that one of the impacts that just using a term like Asian Australian can have on even our own cultures is that it creates a lot of competition in between minority groups. I think if you think of the word Asian, automatically you're thinking Chinese, possibly Japanese, possibly Korean. And you'd be far-fetched to find people, even within the Asian Australian group, you'd be far-fetched to find people who would then start talking about the Singaporean Australian experience or the Taiwanese experience. And I think what a term like Asian Australian, like what that umbrella term can do is that it not only alienates minority Asian groups, but it also creates division across us. And I think it's really important to start owning the term Asian Australian, but also starting to paint some of the nuances attached to it. And I think that's a piece that we need to lead, because we can't expect people who are outside of our culture to really appreciate and understand the nuances. So I think it's really up to us to say, yeah, look, I am an Asian Australian, but to really dive into that, being an Asian Australian is one thing, but I'm also Korean Australian. And I was born here, but I'm still Korean. So it's really starting to unpack that as we talk about the term Asian Australian. But I will admit it's a really easy term to use, and it is something that's tempting, and it is sort of a lazy way to encapsulate the breadth and the depth and the diversity across all of our different cultures. But it is something that we need to kind of watch out for. It's a bit of a catch-22 though.
And so just also furthering what both Shona and Jay have said, I do think if you look historically at the Eastern and Western divides, it's always been a lot easier for a lot of European civilizations to look at the East, to look at the Oriental and the Asian, because it was easier to group them in that way. Obviously, we are all here because of our historical roots and backgrounds, and a lot of what you see in the world today is defined by the language that our predecessors and the predecessors of white Australians, Asian Australians, Aboriginal Australians have actually formed over the years. And I think I have been seeing a lot of movement away from just the umbrella term of Asian Australian, and particularly of the term Asian and Asia itself, because as Jay said earlier, Asia is a very big place, and we have the subcontinent, we have Southeast Asia, we have East Asia. Generally, people from Australia think of the term Asia to encompass only East Asia. Jay mentioned in his podcast, season 1, episode 8, was it? Yeah.
That's the one.
In the UK, Asia is referring to the Indian subcontinent because of that history, because of the British colonial history. But if you go to places in Russia, Russia is a fascinating place for me personally, because there's that, there's that mix of the East and the West, and you have the Occidental and the Oriental all kind of mingle together. And, sometimes if you look at the Western countries, they think of Russia as being too Eastern, too Asian. But if you look at, the Asian continent, Russia itself is very Western. So all these are just ways of dividing people, of categorizing people, which I think is a good starting point. But obviously, there's a lot more nuance that we can explore in the future.
Yeah. So it basically, what I'm getting is it's kind of a shortcut, but it is a very convenient and practical shortcut as a starting point, at least. But I do think it's really important that we're just acknowledging that in the first place, because it really is a very broad umbrella term. So let's move on to the next question. Why does being Asian Australian matter? Why does your identity matter? And is there a particular moment that made you realise that it does matter? So we might start here with Jay, because in our discussions, you mentioned that there was a big moment for you when you travelled solo for 7 months, and you met other Asians who embraced their identities, and that was quite new to you. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I don't know if other people listening feel this way, but growing up in Australia, I kind of had this sense that like being Asian wasn't cool, and like I felt like I had to adopt whiteness and prove myself to be Australian enough, and that was to try and fit in. And so you'd like suppress your Asianness because you didn't want to be seen as Asian. Like I'm sure you've read articles about not wanting to open up your smelly lunchboxes, people making fun of your food. I didn't quite have that, but I had other things similar to that. And so I spent some time just traveling around, and I saw, especially in the US and Canada, that there are a whole bunch of Asians, partly because they had particular cultural revolutions that we haven't had, but they fully embrace this like Asian identity, and they're so proud of this Asianness, which was so foreign to me. Like, because I've just been told my whole life that being Asian wasn't cool, and then suddenly I'm in this place where all of these Asians are like, they love hanging out with each other, and they love doing, celebrating Asian things. Like there'd be a whole bunch of guys who are Asian but not Korean, and they know K-pop dance videos, and they will like dance in front of each other, and they're so proud of this, and many other things. And it was a bit shocking to me, but it showed me that this sort of internalized racism that I had, it didn't have to be the norm. It's what I thought was a norm, but that's because that's all I knew. And I discovered this whole other way of seeing myself, I guess. And in terms of why I think being Asian Australian is important, I mean, look, I think diversity and differences make life interesting. If you think about, like, if you went to Thailand and it was exactly the same as it was back here, like, that'd be boring. That'd be so boring, right? Like, differences are exciting. They're interesting. So us growing up, or like me growing up with Chinese Malaysian parents, means that I will view the world a little bit differently from my white peers and colleagues, just because of that. And that's good. You know, we can contribute, we can see things in a different way. And I think that's something that we should own.
We might move on to Pravin. Did you have any particular stories in relation to this question as well?
Yeah, mine's sort of similar. So when I was in 2015, I was going on exchange to Europe and I was backpacking by myself. And I happened to have found myself backpacking through Europe in the summer of 2015, which turned out to be the migrant crisis. And I had no idea this was happening just because I wasn't checking the news. And I found myself being pulled up by police quite frequently, particularly in Eastern Europe and the former Eastern Germany, like Czech Republic, Hungary, Potsdam. And I had no idea this was going on until I was taking a train from Berlin and found that the trains were cancelled because of the migrant crisis. And this was sort of the first time in my life that I felt very explicit, direct discrimination. You know, I grew up in diverse enough neighbourhoods. You know, all my friends through high school and uni are still now like about half European Australian, half, you know, so many other things. I also, you know, adopted whiteness. I feel like I fit in, and almost in a way, I distanced myself a lot from my heritage. And I never, for example, identified with the term person of colour. And it wasn't until that I was othered by police, by border guards in that way. They were assuming I was a refugee, but it made me realise that, oh, actually, like, I can't just be one of the good ones. Like, you know, I will never be accepted as one of them. And I think that was the moment, I was 20, I realised. I'm not sure if that answers the question directly, why is being Asian Australian important? But to me, all these things are sort of linked together. And I think personally, my identity, whether it's person of colour, Asian Australian, Sri Lankan Australian, it's all still blurry to me. But that was the moment, I think, when I had, I guess, my consciousness was awakened.
I think at the very least you can say it, you know, it affects at least the way that other people see you, whether you like it or not. And I think that's really important to actually just be aware of. So I think you've answered the question, basically. We might move on to Shona. So you've mentioned that feeling alienated in Australian media was an important catalyst for you to become involved in Asian Australian initiatives, and particularly in media-based initiatives. Can you talk a bit more about that?
I think what I'd like to start off with is, you know, obviously I had that journey of embracing the fact that I was an Asian and that I was Korean. And I think that'll come up in a little bit more of my other answers. But one kind of important aspect of this question for me was embracing that I was Australian. And it's also a similar journey. And I think if you think about and reflect on your own identity and your own journey to where you are in that piece, embracing your Australian identity is a huge challenge as well, because on face value, you're not Australian. You know, I did an internship in Thailand and people would ask me, like, where are you from? I'd be like, oh, I'm from Australia. They'd be like, no, you're not. Come on, let's be real. Where are you from? And so I found that dichotomy really interesting. Overseas, I wasn't Australian, but in Australia, I wasn't Australian either. And so embracing my Asian identity was a huge part of actually, I guess, accepting my own Australianness, if that kind of makes sense. So it goes hand in hand. I thought it was a huge privilege to have been born in Australia, to have an Australian education and have an Australian outlook of the world. I think even where we're placed geographically, I had a huge interest in Southeast Asian news and politics while I was studying in university. And I used to think, wow, like, the fact that I'm Asian helps me relate to these people on a cultural level somewhat, but the fact that I'm Australian also equips and empowers me with the skills and the privileges that some of these cultural groups don't have. And that places us in a really unique position. Not only do we have that cultural insight, but we have the education, the economy, the living standards to be able to influence a lot more than we realize. And so I think those two go hand in hand. In terms of being alienated in the media, I think it really came down to just, I was fed up reading stories about, not only about Koreans in Australia, but around other Asian Australian groups and Korea around the world. I just got fed up reading stories written by white Australians. Like, they were writing about things that I was like, you have no idea what that actually means, or you have no idea what kind of impact that might have. And yes, journalists are called to be impartial somewhat and objective to the best of their abilities, but without that context and that cultural nuance, I felt like it was a bit of a shame, because there are a lot of stories that didn't really uncover what was really going on in our culture. And I think that's something that's a gap that we're really uniquely placed to be able to provide and add to our society. So yeah, being Asian, being Korean is really important to me, but also being Australian and being an Australian-born Korean is a completely different dimension that I'm really proud of and trying to embrace more of as well.
Yeah, and you've really prefaced some of the upcoming questions as well, but we'll get to that in a second. And Samantha, did you have any particular stories in relation to this question as well?
Yeah, so I grew up in quite a bubble. I grew up in a very Asian bubble in Sydney. So I did the whole OC, selective school, went to UNSW. So I was very much surrounded by a lot of Asians, particularly a lot of Chinese Australians. During that time, I didn't realize I had an Asian Australian identity. I only had a Chinese identity to distinguish myself from the white Australians. But I didn't have the Australian part of my identity because it was assumed. But the first time I really realized that there was that distinct Asian Australian identity was when I was in Japan, I think when I was 19, for a semester of exchange. And that was when it became really clear that people didn't know how to place me, particularly in Japan, where people weren't very good at English. A lot of the Japanese locals were very surprised that my English was so fluent. They thought that I was Chinese because of the way I look. And, they asked a lot about my Chinese experiences, but they found it difficult to understand the Australian part of my experiences. So, one really obvious thing, I think probably everyone who's Australian has experienced this at some point, is the change of the seasons and how everything is upside down. We have Christmas in summer on the beach. So that's something that a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere couldn't quite reconcile with. And, the fact that I look very much Chinese, but I was, I've grown up in this Australian, in Australia, in Sydney, and in a very diverse place, made it very difficult for me to see that this was 10 years ago, sorry, math is not my forte. It made it really difficult for me to realize that I had to embrace both parts of that identity, and not just the Chinese, not just the Australian part where I'm talking, speaking English all the time, but that kind of dual identity. And that was really difficult. And I still find it really difficult because, what are Australians being known for, right? They're relaxed. They like the beach. They like beers. They like booze. They like the outdoors. What are Asians generally known for? Well, being hardworking, being really good at math, being, what else are Asians known for? People coming from an ancient civilization, liking bubble tea. Okay? All these different parts are in direct contradistinction with each other. So how do we reconcile the two? How can one be Asian and Australian when the Asian part and the Australian parts lie in direct paradox? How does one do that? It's very different from being, say, Asian British, because you're coming from two civilizations that are that have a lot in common. It's different from Asian Americans as well. You know, Asian Canadians, Asian Australians, I find we don't have a lot of voice on the global stage, probably because Australians, generally speaking, don't have that voice. And because we're in such close proximity with Asia, there are actually a lot of Asian Australians around, but we don't have that platform, and people overseas find it very difficult to categorize us. And they find it very difficult to understand our duality because they're so paradoxical.
Yes, some really interesting insights here. You know, I'm getting a lot of differences, but also one interesting common theme, which is, you know, kind of looking outside of Australia, whether that's through travel or exploring what other parts of the world have to offer, have all been quite important to you in really understanding your identities. So maybe a takeaway of this is for people to go travel, obviously when it's safe to do so. But I guess I can also personally relate to, you know, the idea of traveling and really opening up your eyes to how things outside of Australia really impact on how you see your identity. So that was really interesting. Let's move on to the next question. So let's talk about all of your initiatives now. They're all trying to address problems that are really relevant and sometimes really specific to the Asian Australian community. So if we start with Jay, firstly, you started Choose Off because, and I quote here, growing up in Australia, I always had the sense that being Asian meant I was never fully Australian and that I was a bit of a second-class citizen. And I shied away from my Asian heritage because being Asian wasn't cool and because being Asian wasn't white. So can you talk a bit more about how, you know, through Shoes Off, you try and help people embrace their identity?
Yeah, so this sort of racialized view that I have of myself, or had of myself, probably still have a little bit, but it just would manifest in ways of shying away from your culture, right? Like whitewashing your speech. So it's like, what'd you do over the weekend? And be like, oh, I had dinner with my parents. Instead of being like, oh my God, guys, I had hot pot. It was Chinese New Year. It was amazing. Like there is a difference in that, in the way that we communicate. So I grew up in Australia. I love Australia. I'd love to make this a better place, a place that is like truly multicultural, where we have a bit more cultural awareness and understanding. And that's where the podcast comes in. So I'm exploring topics, stories, and issues about being Asian in Australia. So it's not all about the problems that we face, although we do talk about that, but it's also about a lot of our common experiences, like having a name that's hard to pronounce, or probably having been to tutoring in your childhood. I'm going to get a little bit nerdy about podcasts for a bit. There's a spectrum of podcasts out there. You've got your high time and effort ones, which are your This American Life, 99% Invisible, or your true crime and your fiction podcasts, where they're like written and they like take a team to make. And then you've got your like lower effort and time input ones, where they can churn out a lot of episodes pretty quickly. We're talking Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Connie Bang Bang, Hamish and Andy, Shameless, all these sorts of shows, right? I have nothing against low time and low effort, low input shows. There's a place for them. There's a place for lots of chat. I just personally didn't want to make that. I wanted to make something that was more written and produced, something which was more to the point with less superfluous fluff. So you just like, you get to the point, you get more out of each minute, essentially. It'd be much easier for me to like put out a chat that I had with someone for an hour and like, here's an episode. But if you're going to give me your time for listening, then I want to put in the time to make sure that the episodes are really good, that it's entertaining and interesting, and that you're learning a lot from it. So it shows you, yeah, that I'm valuing your time. I'm taking this content seriously, and I like bloody care about these topics. And I want you to as well. That's kind of the point, that you'd learn from them. So yeah, that's the podcast. And I guess the idea is to show you that your experience is, you're not alone in a lot of things that you experience. So it's on one hand, it's like, hey, a lot of us share similar experiences. And on the other hand, it's like, there's a lot of things you probably didn't know, or I'm going to tell you about something that you had no idea was interesting. And by the end of the episode, you'll be like, whoa, that was really cool. Or what? I didn't know that was an issue. I never thought about it in that way. Or, for example, the names episode 1, a very simple thing that a Chinese professor said to me, he was like, your names link you with your family, and your names mean something. And the moment you translate that into Hanyu Pinyin, into English, that meaning is lost. And I was like, oh yeah. Like, I get that. I knew I didn't like the English translation of my name. I didn't know really why, but when he said that, it made so much more sense. So I'm hopefully giving you a few of these aha moments in the show. So yeah, that's the podcast. Shoes off.
Yeah, sounds good. And I can completely say, shamelessly, or maybe with a bit of shame, that there are a lot of stories that you share in your podcast that I had no idea about. So even as an Asian Australian, I think everyone could learn a lot from listening to it. So how, like, from your personal experiences, Jay, how common do you think it is for Asian Australians to not embrace their identities or not really be aware of some of these really interesting experiences that Asian Australians have?
I think, like Shona mentioned, we've got a lot of people. Well, there's not a lot of coverage of our stories in the first place, and if there are, they're not by Asian people. And so we don't really feel like our experiences and our voices are heard. And like an old high school friend who I literally haven't spoken to since high school, like, messaged me out of the blue that he discovered my podcast. And one of the things he said to me was like, I feel like my experiences are so validated, because that's what we've gone through. We've had all these experiences, but they're kind of siloed in ourselves, and we have no one to talk to about them because we think they're just ours. But I'm trying to show you that, hey, you're not alone. So I think they're common. I think there'll be people who probably don't want to admit it, or they've kind of like, they're trying to not be Asian so much that they don't want to associate with this stuff, which is fine. If that's what you want to do, that's what you do that. But if you do feel a little bit of this, this feeling that being Asian isn't good enough and it doesn't sit right with you, then that's what the podcast is trying to be like, hey, I'm here with you. Let's talk about some of these things.
It's kind of funny because, like, embracing your identity, that sounds it sounds so intuitive. Like, we get taught that at school. But you kind of answered this, like, in that last answer, like, rejecting Asian identity or heritage, it is a problem that, like, I personally have observed, and I'm sure, like, others can relate to that. Is there anything you want to add to that as to why you think it is such a common problem despite sounding so, counterintuitive?
It's just part of growing up in a culture that is dominated by white culture. I don't want to sound too radical, but we just live in a country where the people in power and the things we're taught come from essentially a white viewpoint, and that's just how we've all been socialized. I don't want to, like, point fingers at anyone, because I think we just all need to accept that we all have racialized views of ourselves, of each other, of the world, and it's trying to understand that. And it's up to you whether you want to understand that and unpick that, or if you're just happy living your own life. But that's just Australia and a lot of Western countries.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, like, I would agree with that. But yeah, I think we would also both agree that, it's really important to just even think about it, to just stop and take a moment and just try and unpack, your cultural identity. So if we move on now to Samantha, so you started Shakespeare Academy to help Asian students understand English and Western literature better and to improve their general English skills. And what I find really interesting, actually, we'll get onto that in a sec. Let's just talk a bit more about Shakespeare Academy. So how do you kind of help these students pursue English or literature studies through Shakespeare Academy?
So before I answer that specific part of your question, I need to talk a bit about my own high school experience.
Sure.
Which is basically, looking back, I see that a lot of the English teachers were borderline racist. I don't think they were overtly racist. I think they internalized it. but I graduated in 2005. I went to a selective girls' school, and at that time there was still a small percentage of white girls in our cohort. I think maybe 10-15%. We did have a lot of Asians in our year and just throughout the school, but there were quite a few white girls. And it became so apparent to me over the years that the teachers all preferred the white girls because the white girls were better at English. The white girls were better at English because they spoke English at home, and they had these skills that we as Asian Australians, as the children of immigrants, never actually had the chance to learn. You know, they had a vocabulary that far exceeded ours because they spoke English all the time. That became a deterrent for me personally with my English studies. I remember trying to read Shakespeare when I was younger. We had to do a compulsory Shakespeare text every year, but we didn't get it. The teachers didn't really know how to teach it to a class of 30 girls where maybe 25 of them were Asian, right? They didn't know how to speak our cultural language. I think also, looking back, they probably just didn't know English literature well enough. So that's another problem. Now, I loved writing. I loved writing fanfic. Sailor Moon fan fiction is my thing. And I still love Sailor Moon. I'm decked out in Sailor Moon today. But I didn't get encouragement from my writing teachers, from the English teachers, because I was just this crazy Asian chick, who liked some crazy Japanese TV series. And yes, I was using the English language to express myself, but I didn't get a lot of encouragement. And in fact, looking back now, I see that, it was a really sad existence. It was a really sad part of my high school life because, English is compulsory, and we spent countless hours, hundreds and thousands of hours doing all these English essays and reading books by dead white men, and for what? So I thought about that for quite a bit when I finished my PhD. So I finished my PhD in 2016, and I defended my thesis successfully. I think it was right after Brexit. So that made me uncomfortable about staying in the UK. And so I thought about Sydney. I thought about my own experiences growing up. And then, there I was at 27 or however old I was back then, armed with this knowledge of literature, of Shakespeare. And I thought, golly, I could probably do this. I could, by that point, I'd done tutoring for quite a few years. I taught at universities. I taught master's levels Shakespeare, and I thought, golly, I could do this. I could come back to Sydney and I could teach some Asian kids how to read Shakespeare, how to read and understand and appreciate and even enjoy these dead white people's works. Because it's not that hard to understand literature, English literature, if we think of it not just as, it's not just the linguistic problem. It's a problem of culture, of context. Want to explain to a whole bunch of 15-year-olds that Pride and Prejudice is essentially, white people being like Asians and really conservative, but wearing bonnets, and because they care about wealth and class and status, right? It's really just an Asian version. There are lots of Asian values found in the Regency England. As soon as you can communicate that to the children, then they start to get interested. They start to realize, actually, these characters, these stories, they're not just about, white people or dead people or irrelevant people. They're just about humans. And once they start connecting, once they start understanding the literature, they start to enjoy it and they start to improve.
Yeah, I guess, so you talked a lot about, how cultural upbringing can maybe place you at an inherent disadvantage if you didn't grow up speaking as much English as white children. How important, though, do you think it is just to be even a role model for an Asian person, who's passionate about literature, Just to see someone, you know, with a PhD who can teach with so much wealth of knowledge about that, just forgetting about those, you know, those kind of environmental influences for a second. Do you think that representation is a really important function that you serve running the Shakespeare Academy?
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of my training, because I trained in the UK, I did my master's and my PhD in the UK, that actually puts me above a lot of the high school teachers in Sydney, because they're all trained in Australia. And look, we are good for many things, but this country is not good for English literature and this, you know, literary studies. So I think it really inspires a lot of my students to see that there is this, you know, crazy Asian chick who loves Sailor Moon and who loves Snape, who can also, you know, kick ass when it comes to Shakespeare and Austen and poetry and all of that stuff. You know, I think they find it really inspiring, and it actually, a lot of them have improved drastically since they started learning from me, and a lot of them are now beating, you know, they're kicking the asses of their white peers at school. And I find that so encouraging, because that was the kid I would have loved to be, but I wasn't able to be. And I'm seeing my students, you know, I've had students top their grade. I have quite a few foreign English students this year and last year as well. I've got, you know, kids who are in the top cohort, and they're just performing so wonderfully. And it's because, you know, Asians put the time and effort. They go and they do their homework. You know, they put their hours and they do their study. And as soon as you teach them how to go about it, they are so totally invested in the literature, in, you know, the content I teach. But I think, I mean, definitely, just I'm answering your question in a very roundabout way, but yes, I think they find it very inspiring to see someone like me, and also as, you know, a woman, having all this knowledge and just, you know, kicking ass with words.
No, that's awesome. And yeah, speaking of representation, I think it's a good moment to move to Shona. So you've got a variety of experiences in the media. You've written for a bunch of different sites and magazines. And you've really managed through this to increase representation and really shed light on many aspects of Asian Australian culture. One example of that is your project called Don't Tell Anyone, which looks at, you know, how the idea of saving face relates to mental illness, domestic violence, sexual abuse amongst Asian Australians. And you feel particularly passionate about the lack of diversity in Australian media. So can you speak a bit more as, you know, to how your writing really helps to address this diversity issue, and really how you champion minority voices in Australian media?
Thanks, Humphrey. That's really nice of you. I was just laughing because I wasn't sure if I would call it a breadth of experience. It's more just a little bit of everything. So that's really nice. Thank you. You know what? I think what Jay and Samantha shared is pretty much why I do what I do. It's this idea that people can look a certain way but be completely different. And, you know, across all the movies we've watched growing up with Asians, we have such stock standard roles. It's the accountant, the takeaway shop owner, the cleaner, the kid in high school who studies really hard. We're never the superheroes, we're very rarely the superheroes, the main characters of stories, or we're not really complicated characters. And starting to unpack that is something that I'm really passionate about. So I am a freelance writer. I get involved in a lot of awesome initiatives. One of them is Moonrise, and I partner with two other incredible Asian Australian women. And they are really passionate about this too. And so one thing we do on Moonrise is to try and create empathy across people from a variety of different Asian Australian backgrounds, in sharing their stories, talking about things that are important to us, things that are relevant to us, and things that we'd want to read. And what that kind of medium does is it helps you, and this came up before as well, it helps you feel validated. And why that's really important is because I'm going to be really different to the next Korean Australian chick you meet, or Samantha's probably really different to a lot of different Chinese Australians you know. And I think that's the beauty of it, is too often we're seen as one monotonous group. And we started with this question at the start. We're one monotonous group. We're not capable of having complex emotions, complex backgrounds, being sophisticated, smart, sexy, incredibly talented. And I think all of those narratives are something that I want to start unpacking in my writing. There's a lot of great initiatives across Australia that try to champion these sort of diverse stories. I've been really challenged personally because, you know what, I think for me, what I try to do is talk about things that it takes an Asian to know. So saving face was kind of one of those things. And it just started off with this idea of, oh, I felt like in my personal experience, I had this. I wonder if anyone else has had that same experience. And just getting the opportunity to interview a lot of different Asian Australians, Asian Americans, I learned a lot about, wow, people go through this and we don't realize that you're going through it as well because we just never talk about it. And that's where media, that's where storytelling, video production, podcasting, all of these things fit into that because it's about us telling our own stories and really owning that channel. And I'm really excited because I think in Australia, there's a lot of room for growth. We still have so many stories that are untold. You know, the Korean population in Australia is about 0.45%. There's only about 120,000 of us in this country. And so I know for a fact that there's a lot of space for our stories to be told, and I'm sure that's similar across a lot of Southeast Asian Australian communities, a lot of South Asian communities. There's just a lot of breadth, so it's really exciting. What else? The media really is concentrated in Australia. We're one of the most concentrated countries in terms of media ownership, and so the types of perspectives you're getting in the mainstream media are going to be really stock standard. I produce news videos related to Asian Australian events and interesting news topics just from an Asian Australian perspective. I think getting involved with initiatives like this, discussions like this on a Wednesday night, it all adds into kind of highlighting and addressing and talking about our own stories.
Yeah, completely. I completely resonate with everything you just said. Similarly to Jay, do you think the media has such a big role in kind of shaping our perception of reality, and the fact that there maybe aren't many Asian Australians or haven't been many Asian Australian stories in the first place? Do you also think that contributes to this idea that we don't really embrace our culture, or we're often not even aware that we could embrace our culture?
So when I was studying at Sydney Uni, I was doing media and communications, and there were about 5, 6 in a cohort of 100 students that were not Caucasian Australians. And my teachers, the majority of them were Caucasian Australians, same with the tutors, except for a handful of skilled specialists. And so I used to spend a lot of time trying to put myself in their shoes and tell their stories and try and think from their perspective. And that took a lot of training. It took a lot of trying to read up on stories that I just couldn't relate to on a personal level and trying to be someone that I wasn't professionally. Similar to Jay, I did a piece really early on in my career where I wrote about how I used to change my last name to Young because it could pass as a British last name to try just get my foot in the door for certain interviews or certain story pitches. And then that kind of progressed because I realized that my point of difference is actually my strength. So being different, being able to tell stories, there's a time and place for a Korean Australian writer, and that's where I get to step in. But I think what's really interesting is because I remember there was a moment when I was reading, I think it was a Sydney Morning Herald, and there's a Korean journalist by the name Esther Han, and she wrote something, and I just remember seeing her name, and I think I jumped for joy. I was just gobsmacked. I was like, wait a minute, there is someone with a similar name, or just a non-Caucasian name, on the front page of the Sydney bloody Morning Herald. Like it was just mind-boggling at the time. This is, it would have been about 7, 8 years ago now. And that kind of sparked a journey for me where I was really interested in seeking out stories that I could relate to, seeking out writers of color, seeking out stories that were on the fringe, seeking out publications that weren't owned by a Caucasian Australian. And so that really fascinated me. And, when you do read stories, when you do see faces like Tracy Vo on TV, on Channel 9, yes, some of them might be more whitewashed or whatever you want to call it, but it's still a step in the right direction. I know a lot of people have been watching MasterChef, and that's been really big for people, seeing their national foods represented, seeing foods that they love on Australian TV. Things like that are really important because, you start to feel like, what you go about on a day-to-day basis, it actually is valid, it's actually normal, and it's cool. There was a study done, I think it was at ANU a couple of years back, where they interviewed a bunch of international students, and they showed them a lot of different articles from the Australian media, and they asked them, how do you feel after reading these articles? The majority of those international students actually said that they felt they felt like their self-confidence, their self-esteem, and their worth had somewhat been diminished by these negative articles. And it's little things like the semantics that we use to describe international students, the semantics we use to describe Asian groups, Asian business owners, Asian cleaners, illegal immigrants. All of those things play into this stereotype that we hold against Asians. And we might not realize it on a day-to-day conscious level, but deep down it does affect the way we hold ourselves. There's been a lot of research, and I can't really talk into this because, I'm not an expert in this space, but there's a lot of research done into how we tend to undervalue our own skill sets and our own achievements. So we'd be like, oh, I'm not that great, but yeah, I am a doctor. I'm not that great. I guess I'm okay, but I did study medicine, but, I'm okay. Like, we tend to do that with our own achievements. And I think a lot of that, we might think we're just being humble or because we grew up in an Asian family, but a lot of that has to do with the majority, the white dominated media in which we play, the pop culture, the references, the TV shows, all of that plays into how we hold ourselves and how we see ourselves. So starting to unpack that is something that I'm really excited about.
Yeah. And I think this, hopefully for tonight, it'll be a good first step for even one viewer. That would be awesome, because I think you really speak some very true words, and I think it is really important for many people growing up to really see just faces and stories that they can directly relate to. And so, speaking of the research, particularly ANU research, let's move on to Pravin. So Pravin, you work as a project coordinator within the diplomacy team at AsiaLink, and you're also a key organiser of the Asian Australian Leadership Summit. And one stat that you pointed out, which really stuck with me, was that even though Asian Australians account for roughly 12% of the population, this is of the most recent census, they make up only 2.4% of senior leadership in 2019. So can you talk a bit more about this senior leadership problem and how you think AALS is helping to address it?
Yeah, so Asian Australians essentially have the problem in that we encounter what some people call a sticky floor or a bamboo ceiling, in that a lot of workplaces, especially, corporate finance sort of workplaces, love to hire us, but they don't like to promote us very much. So you'll often find it, say, certain big professional services firms have fairly diverse, racially diverse and gender diverse graduate intakes. But as you go higher and higher up the ladder and the pyramid gets smaller and smaller, it becomes more Anglo, more male. This ANU, so the Leadership Summit was a partnership between AsiaLink, the Australian National University, and PwC Australia. And as part of the summit, ANU's Centre for Social Research did a study for us on Asian Australians' experiences of discrimination. And we found that Asian Australians were actually the most underrepresented group in Australia after Indigenous Australians, and that we reported the highest rates of discrimination of any group that we looked at. Just to cite some numbers for you, within the workplace environment, only 17% of Asian Australians agree that their organisation uses their Asia capability well. Only 1 in 5 are very satisfied with their career opportunities. Only 22% strongly agreed that their workplaces even value cultural diversity, and 30% said they were likely to leave their employer in the next year, which is quite horrific. And it varies by industry. Corporate is actually slightly better than the public sector, and Parliament, for example. It might reflect the graduate intake, but the then Chancellor of ANU, Gareth Evans, who used to be our foreign minister in the 80s, he launched the Leadership Summit with a speech called Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling. And he addressed not only that this is horrific just from our perspective, but also in terms of the wider Australian community, how much is lost when Asian Australians are underrepresented. Australia exists in Asia. We trade predominantly with Asia. Majority of our overseas intake is from Asia. We're so deeply connected to Asia that having Asian Australians be underrepresented at senior levels hurts us. There are so many examples, you know, whether it's in a business context or a diplomatic context, where whether it be a deeper cultural understanding, a linguistic background, even just a friendly face can actually help so much. Like, I know just anecdotally, in the late 2000s, I think about 2005, when there was a series of media articles about attacks against, I think, probably Indian international students in Melbourne, like people getting robbed, waiting for trains and so forth. But it caused a big media uproar in India. Our High Commissioner to India at the time, Peter Varghese, was Indian Australian, and he was able to finesse that situation very well, in a way that probably most other diplomats could not have. And because of his efforts, we've managed to repair that relationship, which we probably underestimated here, how much of a scandal that caused in India. And international student numbers for the next couple of years fell quite substantially from India because of that. So the Leadership Summit essentially brought together senior leaders from all different industries. A majority were Asian Australian, but there was also a lot of non-Asian Australians in the room. And it convened an effort over 2 days in September of last year at the State Library of Victoria to break through the bamboo ceiling. We also, as part of this, had a next-gen dialogue for young people. So a whole day just for Asian Australians aged 18 to 40, where they, you know, had panel discussions, we got through some practical workshops and learned some skills for how to break through barriers in the workplace. We also had a 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australian awards, which are won by Dr. Munira Bano, who's a computer science lecturer at Swinburne and now Deakin. Another winner you might know is Benjamin Law. Adam Liao from MasterChef was one of the judges, and he gave the keynote address at the awards dinner, which went down really well. And just one particular issue I want to talk about when talking about the summit was, in some ways, we're a bit fortuitous in that we got a lot of media coverage, more than we had even hoped for, just because it came a couple of weeks after the Gladys Liu scandal last year. So I'm not sure if all you remember, but the member for Chisholm, which covers Box Hill, Glen Waverley, where I grew up, where my parents still live, is a Chinese Australian woman who she was accused of being a communist spy by the media last year. There was like a whole lot of slander against her. And, you know, Asian Australians who were quite opposed to her politically, because she has her own problematic views on gender and the LGBT community, came out to defend her. And people I know who had, you know, someone I know who'd written articles criticizing her for her views before, who's Asian Australian, came out and defended her. And we were able to use the summit then to talk about xenophobia, which is an emerging issue which never really gets talked about. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be talked about more and more in Australia, particularly so xenophobia is discrimination against Chinese Australians. And what we're seeing now essentially is that as Australia and China's relationship becomes more tense, that we're seeing an increase in xenophobia throughout the community. And I can definitely say, and I'm sure this won't surprise many people, that it's not just white Australians. I feel like xenophobia is endemic among Sri Lankan Australians, and Sri Lanka is politically sort of aligned with China also. That doesn't mean anything. And we're essentially seeing this situation quite similar to European anti-Semitism with Chinese Australians, in that there are two paradoxical sort of competing things that threaten people. So one is that Chinese Australians are simultaneously associated with money and success and influence in that aspect, but also associated with communism because of China. And that is very, very similar to the Jewish experience in Europe. And what I'm afraid we'll see is if the relationship deteriorates further, that we'll see more and more white-anting by the media, more xenophobia by the media. I could send you screenshots of, I'm sure we've all seen so many xenophobic and racist front pages on certain tabloid newspapers and even the occasional broadsheet newspaper. It kind of cuts across the entire media landscape. And I'm just afraid that we'll see this happen more and more. And I think we need solidarity between different Asian Australian groups in order to combat this, because often people, I think we've mentioned before, often associate Asia with just being China. I think we need other voices, Vietnamese Australian voices, Cambodian Australian voices, Indian Australian voices to stand up on this issue, because we are, in this sense, all in it together. And if we don't stand up for others in our community, no one else will. So I thought it was great that we put the issue on the agenda. I only think that issue is going to become more and more salient over time. But hopefully we've at least started the conversation to try and address it.
And maybe this relates. Sorry, I just heard myself echo there. Hopefully. Is that better?
No, you sound great to me.
Okay. Hopefully that does kind of relate back to that original question, which is, why do we group Asian Australians together? And we'll move on in a second, but you work on all these issues in what is technically a professional context. But how does that kind of affect you personally? For example, when you look at your own career, and assuming that you want that career progression to become a senior leader, how does that kind of affect you when you work on that problem and you're so aware of it every day? So you work on all these issues in the professional context technically. How does that affect you on the personal level in terms of looking at career progression and things like that?
Yeah, I would say that I was pretty unaware of these issues before being involved in the summit. Like, I knew, for example, that Asian Australians are discriminated against in the workplace. I didn't know how bad it was. I didn't know how systemic it was. I also, and this should have been obvious to me, learned that, for example, Asian Australian women have a harder time because they have faced, two sets of barriers which kind of reinforce each other. I'd say it's helped me at least be more aware of, and this sort of occurred to me on an unconscious level. I'm the only non-white person in this room. I'm the only X person in this room. I think it's helped me speak more fluently on these issues and understand the importance of that solidarity. It's always really interesting to me now when you see, consultants, for example, who are so diverse and the partners who are so not diverse.
There's definitely room another day to unpack all of the things that you've all four of you have talked about. But in the interest of time, I think we do need to move on. So our next question is, and we're going to group these two together. So how have your respective initiatives helped you firstly understand who you are and understand your identity, but also just in other aspects of life? And that could really be anything. That could be your career, your personal relationships, your family, etc. And anyone's free to begin this one.
So I'll start by saying that paradoxically, teaching English to a lot of Chinese Australian students has taught me the importance of learning Chinese properly, because I have to communicate with these Chinese parents and I can't express myself the way I want to. There are so many things I want to say to these parents about how they should not, force their children to do what they don't want to do. And I want to explain to them the beauty of English literature and the English language, and not just for a nice ASA, not to get into medicine and law and whatever double degree that they want their kids to get into. So that's something that I've learnt from I suppose not necessarily just the teaching aspect, but dealing with other Asian Australians, particularly immigrant parents who have different sets of expectations and concerns for their children, in the same way that my parents had for me, in the same way that I had to go and fight for myself. I had to advocate for myself when I was growing up, because I was into a whole bunch of really weird stuff, but I want to be there for my children, or hundreds of them. I want to really help them have a voice, and that's something that I've come to really realize about my own identity.
So for me, I think one thing that my initiative has helped me with is like knowing that basically ignorance is bliss. Like once you know a lot of these things, once you've read into them, you understand some of the nuances of certain issues, it's so much harder to turn a blind eye to them. For example, I haven't experienced a lot of outright racism in the workplace, but then hearing other people's stories, like a senior writer being asked, "Oh, how's your grammar?" Like, what the heck? It just reveals how sometimes we don't think a comment like that, you wouldn't call that racist it doesn't sound like it's racist, and they wouldn't think that it's racist, but there are racial intentions behind that, because they see this Asian girl and they're like, oh, she might not have good English. I better check that her grammar's good, right? So it's a splitting of intention and outcome. And we want to say that good intentions mean that it's okay, but really the outcome comes from these long-rooted prejudices that we have. We've learnt them since we were a baby. And this goes all the way back into our history. And that's one thing that I've covered as well is Chinese Australian history, which learning about it, it makes me like way more proud to be Asian Australian, I guess, knowing the things that our ancestors, people before us have gone through and how they paved a way for us to be here today. It definitely makes me more proud. But yeah, firstly, ignorance is bliss. But outside of identity, look, I'm not particularly career ambitious. Like my day job is my day job and allows me to do my podcast essentially. But doing this podcast has connected me with so many other people who care about Asian Australian things, like Shona here, who I did an episode with, season 2, episode 2, on saving face, and like Humphrey, who I met earlier as well, and the other panelists today, all of you guys who have attended today, so many others. Like, because I'm now thinking and into this space, I guess, I'm always being sent these like cool topics that I should cover, which I have like no clue about. So someone the other day messaged me and was like, Jay, you should do an episode on like representation in fashion. And I'm like, yeah, cool. I don't know anything about fashion. Like, tell me what's interesting there. They told me all this stuff, like all the things that you can talk about when it's just about representation in fashion, why it matters. And I'm like, wow, this really does matter. And so all these things I wouldn't have been aware of if I wasn't connected to these people and having their different viewpoints. So yeah, it's really, this initiative of mine has shown me how much I didn't know in this space and how much more I have to learn and how much more I want to explore Asian Australian topics and issues.
Yeah, very well said, Jay. Not too much more to add. I think similarly, I would say that delving into topics that we write about or we talk about and we share with others, it helps you embrace your own struggles and your own challenges. It gives you the space to reflect. It gives you the space to heal from certain experiences, validate things that you didn't think needed validating, but you realize that, hey, that actually happened to other people. A prime example would be just watching others have just so much relief and healing from sharing their story, although it was anonymously for a lot of people, sharing their stories about sexual abuse, about depression, about mental illness on a platform and getting other people responding, being like, oh my gosh, like this is me as well, like something really similar happened to me. Thank you for sharing. Those kind of responses really helped those people who had bravely decided to share their story. And so even just as a writer, as just the messenger of that, watching that was really encouraging and very empowering for me as well. It helps you overcome certain challenges that you have. I would say though that if all of these initiatives, if it did nothing to change the real lived experiences of other minority groups in our country, then I would say that we are missing the mark. So as much as it does bring a lot of self and introspection and a lot of healing, I think there is a part where we need to remember that ultimately there are other groups that are, for example, women and refugees from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. If our work doesn't help them, if our work doesn't encourage them and give them more visibility, and they're just one example, but I think we're really missing the point. It's not just so we feel better about ourselves. That's a great part. That's a great benefit of the work we do. But at the same time, I would really challenge people to say, look, you're doing this because you've experienced what it's like to be othered, but there are people who are still being othered. And so recently we just went through the BLM movement in Australia. I really wrestled with that because just before the BLM movement, I was talking a lot about how, similar to what Pravin brought up, but xenophobia, I was talking a lot about how Chinese Australians were enduring a lot of racism because of coronavirus. And then as soon as BLM movement happened, I was like, wait, how do we as Asian Australians respond to this? And so I sat with that for a really long time, actually, and I'm still kind of delving through some of those issues. But you know what? I think if we don't respond, if we don't ally with other minority groups and other minority experiences, I would say that the things that we talk about are really shallow. So I don't know if that's uncomfortable for some people, but I would really say use your weaknesses, use your hurt, use your struggles to really help make a difference, and enjoy all of the benefits along the way.
Most of my neighbours are Vietnamese refugees. There's also a very substantial East African population in the towers. People don't think of that when they hear that the towers are being turned into prisons. I'm talking specifically of the North Melbourne and Flemington towers and the Kensington towers. My neighbours are Vietnamese refugees who came from the 70s. If we only have certain types of Asian Australians succeed, that's not enough. It's great that, it would be great to have another Asian Australian CEO, but does it matter as much when they're the child of millionaire financiers from Hong Kong versus someone who grew up in public housing in Springvale? We need to talk about these intersections, I guess. I know it's a very popular word, but even though the leadership summit was very much geared about senior level, I'm always very conscious of, for whom, are Asian Australians just going to get a seat at the table only to then perpetuate the same system, but with a different mask on? I don't think that's good enough. I think if we're going to have power and a seat at the table, we need to demand real change to, like you said, our material conditions, not just for ourselves, but for other groups. If you look at non-European Australians, Asian Australians are the majority of non-European Australians. That's a tremendous platform that we hopefully one day will have as we're better represented. And we need to use that to help African Australians and Indigenous Australians, because they, not to minimize our experiences, but I would say that, if you look socioeconomically, if you look at rates of education, income, Indigenous Australians and African Australians are worse off in Australia than we are, and we need to lift them up with us as we rise. I'm talking as a whole generally. Because if not, it's not good enough. All we'll be doing is putting a fresh set of paint on an existing, very white-dominated structure and a classist structure. And that's my rant.
I think there's a general theme I'm getting here, which is that we are only at the very, very beginning of a very long race, and a race that probably doesn't really have a finish line. And there's a lot more to unpack. There's a lot more to really address. And having all this representation is really good, but there are further steps to move on. So just in the interest of time again, I'm going to go to the next question. And this is really, this is the second last question, and I'm going to group them together again. So we've shared, some initiatives by and for Asian Australians today, and I highly encourage everyone to check them out, and we will link them in a second. But other than that, do you guys have any, resources or initiatives that we haven't mentioned today that you can provide to our viewers if they want to dive more into the heritage, or if they want to be more involved with the Asian Australian community? Anyone's free to take this one.
So if anybody wants to join a book club in Sydney, come join us crazies reading Asians. Crazies reading Asians, basically it's a book club. We meet on the third Wednesday of every month, and we just read books by Asian writers, and we chat about them and, have some drinks, have some nibbles, treat it like therapy sometimes, more often than not, actually. This month we're doing Ando's The Happiest Refugee. So it's a memoir by our very own Vietnamese Australian comedian. I think next month we're doing, a YA. So we've got lots of fun books. It also, it helps us read a bit more widely. So it's always great for me as someone who works in literature to see a lot of diverse voices, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen this outpouring of literature by Asian writers, Asian Anglophone writers, and it's great. So yeah, come join us.
That is linked in approximately 2 slides, by the way. So just keep an eye out.
I think there's another great resource, which if you're on good terms with them, your parents, they can probably teach you a lot about your own heritage and culture. So I think that's a really good place to start. Then obviously consuming media made by people of color, Asian Australian blogs, like go to Shona's website, read her stuff, watch TV shows, Asian Netflix. Like there's so much Asian content on Netflix now. It's amazing. But it's just building that pride in your own culture. And then get educated. So because of Black Lives Matter, luckily for you, a lot of the like bestsellers at the moment are books about race. So just jump onto the New York Times bestsellers list at the moment. I think in the top 10, there's at least 4 or something, or top 20. There's a lot. There's a lot there, and there's a lot that you can learn about the way we view race, and it's going to permeate our lives probably for the rest of our lives. So I think it's really worth understanding. So yeah, get educated, obviously listen to my podcast, start talking about your culture as well with your Asian and non-Asian friends. So don't be shy to share things that you're experiencing, that you like, that's on your mind. And I think that's going to help open up that conversation as well. And yeah, just realize that your culture and upbringing means that you have a different perspective, and that's good. You see things differently. So don't be afraid to show that you see things differently.
I would say this is a really good place to start. I think a lot of the times the best resources that I've found have been through people. So if I've needed for example, a human resource, a designer, then I would reach out to someone from either the Asian Creative Network in Sydney or the AAP, these guys, and they would be able to connect me with different people. And so at this point, I would say that really having people, having a community where we're not in competition with one another, but we're here to support each other is really helpful. So don't be embarrassed or afraid to reach out and be like, I don't know what this is, but do you mind doing this? Do you mind reading this over for me? Do you mind connecting me with someone? That's one really big plus, because, a simple Google search can give you a lot of different results, but the recommendations really point you in the right direction. And my favorite book is actually Min-Jin Lee's Pachinko. I know it was really hyped a couple of years ago, but I got the chance to see her speak in person, and that was mind-blowing, because not only is she a Korean writer, but it was just crazy. But yeah, her book is incredible. So I would say there's a lot of books, just because they're written by, or just because something is produced by a person of color, doesn't mean that it's always going to be your favorite thing. So don't be afraid to not like it. I think we need to start, not in competition, but we need to start championing each other for the best quality work. So feel free to read widely, listen to a lot of different things, watch a lot of different things, and then, just find what you like. And I know that sounds really, really cliche and really pointless, and I feel like I'm not providing any help, but I think that would have eased a lot of burden off me starting out on this process, because I used to think, oh my gosh, I need to read everything related to this, but you simply can't. So I think the best thing would be to start your own journey, think about what you like, think about what questions you want answered, and then do your research, start reaching out to people, ask questions, be humble, be willing to learn, and then you'll be connected with the right resources.
I'm not a big fan of some of the new books that are really popular right now. Like, I read White Fragility and I did not like it at all. I know it was a New York Times bestseller. It was written by a white diversity consultant, and I just, didn't vibe with it. I personally would recommend just as one book. It's by Frantz Fanon, he wrote in French, but he's from Martinique, and he wrote in 1952 a book called Black Skin, White Masks, which I read in uni, and it was a revelation to me. The Wretched of the Earth by him is very popular as well. He's a psychiatrist by background, and so he really looks at that internalized self-hatred in the colonial context comes through, and that he's not Asian or Asian Australian, but I think that really spoke to me. And I just say, in terms of ways to engage, I like the point about talking to your parents. I think the most important thing that people could do right now is talk to white boomer parents, because they're people who have political power and monetary power. When their opinions shift, everything else shifts. It's crazy how much the corporate world shifted on Black Lives Matter very quickly, like it did with queer rights. And I think it was because, and I think we might see this maybe with climate as well, hopefully in the future, is that when consumers who have purchasing power, university educated white people, 40 plus, they have disproportionate impact. And if we can find a way to reach them, most of us here probably don't have parents in that demographic, but getting your white friends to talk to their parents, I think that matters a lot. And yeah, I think always just be mindful of just speaking to echo chambers. I don't personally like to post too much on social media about some of these issues, just because I know I'm mainly speaking to an audience of other people who are really clued in like I am. And it was only really, I think recently I did a lot more because I saw predominantly white people posting about race on my Instagram story. And I'm like, wait, hold on a second. Like, if you're going to have this conversation with at least another person who thinks similarly to you, at least have some representation in there.
Fantastic. So there's one last question, but before we get to that, I am aware that we're at 8:30 and we did schedule this to 8:30, but because we're all having so much fun connecting and sharing our stories, we might go a little bit over time, so that you'll still have your chance to have ask your questions. If you do have to leave now, feel free to pop your question in the chat, and it will be answered. And of course, this will be recorded, so you can always tune in and hear the answer to your question later. But let's move on to the final question. And I'm just going to speak briefly about this one. So we don't have like any expectations about what you want to get out of this panel. We do hope that you learned something. But if there was a key point, or a moral of the story, if you will, all four of these panelists have engaged and found a lot of value from their unique identities and their heritage. So my final question to the panelists is, would you say that Asian Australians can view their identities as an advantage, and they can actually leverage that to bring value to themselves and the communities around them? And what tips would you give to our viewers watching to really take advantage of this? Open to everyone.
I don't have a really sophisticated answer here, but I would say in my personal experience, just being true to what you're feeling, what you're thinking, the way you see things is a good starting point. I mean, always be open to learning, always be open to testing where your assumptions and where your stereotypes come from. But I think that moment when you start to understand why you see things a certain way, that starts to give you insight around your unique identity, because guaranteed the way you see the world is going to be different to the way the narrative is painted, again, on the media, on the TV. And so that's a good starting point. Look for the gaps, look for the disconnect. I would say learn why that disconnect exists, and then start to delve into that. It's going to be a real long-winded thing, but it's a fun journey that'll produce some good stuff out of it.
So the educator in me is going to say, do what you love. That's the most important thing. Whatever it is, if you like numbers, if you like cars, you like pianos, you like, Sailor Moon, whatever it is that you love, spend time on that and realize that your identity is unique to you, but you don't have to think of it as an Asian Australian identity. If you feel like it's too much to unpack at any given point in time, just do what you love and do it from the perspective of you. Think about what, white people have been doing all these, centuries. They tell their stories, they do their thing from their experiences. And they don't need to justify their own experiences with any kind of label. They don't need to say, right, this is me as a suburban mother of 3 from Southern America who wants to write a story about so on and so forth. They don't need to justify themselves. And I think it's so important for us not to be in any way ashamed or afraid because of our identities, but I think it's important to own it. If you are good at grammar, if you think that your grammar is much better than anyone else's, and someone says, oh, can I check your grammar, and you're the senior writer, you might tell them off. Okay, maybe, you might not want to be super aggressive. Okay, maybe this is just me. I can be a bit aggressive at times, but be confident and realize that your experiences are completely valid, and just try to own it like a straight white man would do. Whatever you want to work on. So for example, I love writing a lot of stories. I make iPhone games on the side, and I've written a visual novel set in the Regency. So we have a sequel coming up, and I'm going to include, all of these characters from, this is Regency England, so we're looking at 1811 to 1820. We're going to include some characters from the Asian subcontinent, because I can, and because that's a part of the Regency that we've not looked at. Okay, so whatever you're interested in, whatever you love, stick to that, and then let the rest of you feed into that.
I want to say we're better than I could, so I'm going to skip my turn.
Oh, okay, I'll go. I'll be really quick. Obviously, I think that being Asian is an advantage in Australia, because you have the fortunate thing of understanding like the white Australian perspective, and also your sort of Asian perspective. You've got like two lenses that most white people don't have. So hell yeah, it's an advantage. You should be proud of that. That's all.
And Pravin had something, I think.
No, I was just saying before that Samantha said everything I wanted to say way better than I could. So yeah.
Great. Okay. That brings us to our set questions, and we have reached the end. And as promised, here's everyone's socials and some lovely pictures as well. So feel free to reach out to any of these 4 panelists if you have a question, if you want to find out more about what they do, if you just want to connect with them. And of course, check out the websites of their specific initiatives. They're also linked below, and we will make separate posts on our socials, so our Facebook and LinkedIn pages especially, sharing more detailed socials, more detailed versions basically of this slide for everyone. But as promised as well, we're now free to open up the floor for audience questions. And so how this is going to work is, if you have a question, we'd like you to use the raise hand feature on Zoom. It should be it should be in your reaction tab on the bottom. And do let me know if you can't do that. And we will basically unmute you and you can ask the question directly. You can also copy and paste the question into the Zoom chat. So that's up to you. And I think we're going to take 3 questions, just because we're a bit conscious of time. But if you do have any questions that aren't answered, please reach out to these panelists individually as well. I'm being told there is a specific question about the Melbourne Book Club. Sarah, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask that question on behalf of me, because I don't know what I'm doing with technology and I can't see the question.
So the question says, it's from Thomas Venbull, asking, is there a Melbourne equivalent to the aforementioned book club that any attendees or panelists could recommend?
I don't know of any, but how about you start one? I can help you set up. I can give you a list of recommendations. Yeah, that's how I started my book club. I wanted to talk to other people about Asian books or books written by Asian authors, and there wasn't anything out there, so I formed one.
It looks like actually that might be the questions for now. But as I said before, please reach out to these lovely panelists on their socials, and we will kind of share this slide particularly after the event as well. So don't worry if you didn't get it down. But other than that, that brings us to the end of our first ever edition of Fireside Chats. We're firstly incredibly grateful to our panelists for giving up their time tonight and for talking about their experiences. I guess we can give them an E round of applause, although it's probably not the same as if we were all there in person. Also, a big thanks goes to my own team for helping me to make this event possible. And lastly, a big thank you for everyone who attended tonight. This is not intended to be the last Fireside Chats. We intend to do more of this. So please do connect with us on our socials, our emails there if you have any thoughts or questions that you wanted to share. and look out for more of these events in the future. We hope you enjoyed yourselves, and most importantly, we hope you learned something meaningful about being Asian Australian. Thank you.